Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. Things didn't stop here. Bai Xiaochun immediately began working on a second tongue of 18 colored flame. Time passed. Throughout the course of the night, he conjured a total of 10 18 colored flames. Every single one succeeded. He didn't even come close to a failure. If word of this got out, the entire wildlands would be shaken, and countless necromancers would be thrown into a frenzy. No one had ever seen anything like it. And yet, here, on the banks of the underworld river, it was happening. It would have been impossible for Bai Xiaochun to do this all on his own. And although some of it had to do with the formula, most of it was because of the advice given by the gravekeeper. When coupled with Bai Xiaochun's ability to focus, and his familiarity with medicine formulas, it made things go even more smoothly. In the end, he did something that could shake all of heaven and earth. He conjured 10 high-level flames in a row, without making a mistake. Perhaps it was because of Bai Xiaochun's mask, or perhaps because of the gravekeeper, but when those 18 colored flames appeared, the only other person who could see them was Bai Hao. And of course, Bai Hao was overwhelmed with joy. Although he knew that his master had already succeeded twice in the past, he hadn't been present the first time, and the second time, he hadn't dared to come out to observe. But this time, he could see clearly, and it led him to the realization that nobody in all of the wildlands could possibly stand on equal footing as his master. Not even the other 3 secretive and elusive earthly necromancers could hold a candle to him. To be able to casually conjure such flame 10 times in a row was a completely and utterly shocking matter. Bai Xiaochun now had full and unshakable control over 18 colored flame. He was very excited, and yet, he knew that this was only the first step. The 10 tongues of 18 colored flame that he had just conjured were the building blocks with which he would conjure a 19 colored flame. Unfortunately, those 10 tongues of flame represented a massive amount of resources. Furthermore, he had lost his source of income. Right now, he only had enough to try one time. Although he would still have some resources left over in the end, they would only be about 10% of what he needed to make another attempt. No wonder earthly ranked flames are so rare. It's not just because of the number of earthly necromancers, it's because of the vast amount of resources required to make them. Although he wasn't sure how other earthly necromancers conjured flame, based on his current skill and experience, he knew that, regardless of what technique was used, the cost would be roughly the same. Bai Xiaochun sat there quietly for a moment, looking at the 10 tongues of 18 colored flame. Suppressing his excitement, he closed his eyes for a moment to settle his thoughts. He knew that the moment of truth had arrived. 19 colored flame. I've done months upon months of research, and had help from Bai Hao and great-grandpa Gravekeeper. I have to make it work. A moment later, his eyes snapped open. Spreading his hands wide, he pulled the 10 tongues of flame together. Although it didn't seem difficult to merge them into one, Bai Xiaochun and Bai Hao had spent a huge amount of time working on the various details and steps required. The entire process had been mapped out via augury, with numerous critical issues resolved with advice from the Gravekeeper. Only with hard work and a bit of luck did Bai Xiaochun reach the point where he could so smoothly conjure flame. And thus it was that the 10 tongues of 18 colored flame slowly merged together in front of Bai Xiaochun, right above the surface of the underworld river. His hands flashed constantly with various incantation gestures. Occasionally he would pull out a special soul to add into the mix according to the method that he and Bai Hao had devised. As he made these constant adjustments, the sea of flames gradually became more and more perfect. Time marched on, and everything went according to plan. However, conjuring a 19-colored flame was still no easy task. It required utter concentration on Bai Xiaochun's part, to the point where his eyes were completely bloodshot. Not daring to make the slightest slip-up, he proceeded along carefully for about 2 hours until all 10 tongues of 18-colored flame had been perfectly combined. Although the heat of this sea of fire vastly surpassed that of an 18-colored flame, Bai Xiaochun's ability to control the heat had also increased. The beads of sweat which popped out on his forehead quickly evaporated. Taking a breath, he drew upon the power of his cultivation base to crush the sea of fire down. Compress. Rumbling sounds filled the air, and yet, neither Zhou Yixing nor anyone else in the area noticed. As far as they were concerned, the scene on the banks of the underworld river was the same as ever. Bai Xiaochun wasn't aware of that, though. He was fully concentrating on the process of compressing the sea of fire. Meanwhile, Bai Hao remained off to the side, watching nervously. Considering all of the auguries we performed, there shouldn't be any problems. Although Bai Hao was constantly worrying about what would happen, he didn't let that show on his face, for fear of it affecting his master. His eyes remained fixed on the sea of fire, which writhed defiantly like some primordial beast. However, no matter how it struggled, it couldn't break free from Bai Xiaochun, and was forced to be tamed. It took time for the sea of fire to compress, although Bai Xiaochun actually had no idea how much time had passed. All he knew was that his exhaustion was rapidly mounting. Before long, the sea of fire was only 300 meters across. That was his limit. His cultivation base had been almost completely sucked dry, and he was so tired that his mind was about to shut down. "Hower," he cried out. In almost immediate response, Bai Hao flicked his sleeve, sending a medicinal pill flying out into Bai Xiaochun's mouth, which he consumed in one gulp. Warmth immediately began to flow through him, returning his cultivation base to its peak, and settling his mind. Enthused, and eyes shining brightly, he sent out more cultivation base power, and also shoved his hands closer together. As a result, the beast-like sea of fire struggled as it shrank. 270 meters, 240 meters, 210 meters. Bai Xiaochun didn't hold anything back from his cultivation base. The sea of fire struggled mightily, and yet nothing changed. It continued to shrink all the way until it was only 120 meters across. After that, it shrunk to 90 meters, 60 meters, 30 meters. By this point, his cultivation base was again almost completely drained. And yet, that was exactly what his apprentice's auguries had predicted would happen. When it gets down to 24 meters, Bai Xiaochun thought, "I'll consume another heaven-cleaving good fortune pill. That should be enough. It's too bad that I can only consume a total of 9 heaven-cleaving good fortune pills. After that, they won't work." Unfortunately, there was nothing he could do about the matter now. He had to take advantage of this opportunity. If he could enhance his nascent soul and thus increase his cultivation base, then eventually he wouldn't need any heaven-cleaving good fortune pills. He could just directly conjure 19 colored flames. "Compress," he growled, his eyes blood red. Rumbling sounds echoed out as the sea of fire shrank down until it was 24 meters across. "Hower." Bai Hao knew exactly what to do, and sent a second heaven-cleaving good fortune pill over to Bai Xiaochun. After consuming it, Bai Xiaochun's eyes shone, and he continued to work on shrinking the fire. Rumble. 21 meters. 18 meters. Finally, 15 meters. It was at 15 meters when the sea of fire began to struggle most viciously. Bai Xiaochun's cultivation base was being drained rapidly, and his exhaustion was again mounting. However, it was at that point that another color appeared within the 15-meter sea of fire. The fact that he had begun his endeavor with 15 colored flames was no waste. As of this moment, there wasn't a single portion of the 19th color, but rather, 10. That ensured that the chances of success were increased significantly. Although Bai Xiaochun was panting nervously as he stared at the new color, he used the method devised by Bai Hao's augury to analyze it. After studying it for about 10 breaths of time, his eyes began to shine, and it was without the slightest hesitation that he sent some divine sense power into the fire. He didn't make the slightest mistake. His divine sense immediately locked onto the 19th color. Rumble. The 19th color began to shine with blinding brightness, like a dragon flying up into the heavens. That 19th color soon completely distinguished itself from the other 18 colors. It worked. Bai Hao shouted excitedly. Bai Xiaochun laughed hoarsely, but with passion as he reached out to grab the flame. "Come to me, 19-colored flame," he shouted. Rumbling sounds echoed out loudly as his hands closed around the fire. The flame sank down into his hand until it couldn't even be seen. His fingers trembled slightly, and Bai Hao looked on, completely nervous. Although Bai Hao was convinced that his master couldn't fail, he was still worried about what would happen. Master and apprentice exchanged a glance, and then Bai Xiaochun took a deep breath and slowly opened his fingers. As he did, a tongue of 19-colored flame was clearly visible above his palm. 19-colored flame, success. No one knew that he had conjured a 19-colored flame. After coming to realize this, Bai Xiaochun came to the conclusion that it wasn't his mask which had concealed the fact, but rather, the gravekeeper. Furthermore, after the 19-colored flame appeared, the gravekeeper himself was nowhere to be seen. The underworld river also vanished. It was almost as if his presence during the past year had only been in order to give advice to Bai Xiaochun and Bai Hao. Now that Bai Xiaochun had succeeded in conjuring 19-colored flame, there was no further need for the gravekeeper to stay. However, the night before disappearing, he had broken from his usual practice of being tight-lipped to give extensive advice about flame conjuring. Therefore, although Bai Xiaochun and Bai Hao felt a bit strange to be alone, they were moved by all of the information he had imparted. Master, all of the advice from Great-Grandpa Gravekeeper was incredible. 20-colored flame is the peak of the earthly rank, and although it will be very difficult, I feel quite confident that I can create the formula for you. In fact, I'm going to go into secluded meditation to work on it. Clasping hands, he bowed and said, Master, take care of yourself while I'm away, sir. Bai Xiaochun took a deep breath, patted him on the shoulder, and nodded. Then, Bai Hao became a beam of glowing soul light that vanished into his soul-hoarding pagoda. A few more months went by, but the gravekeeper never returned, and Bai Hao remained in seclusion. Bai Xiaochun didn't have enough ingredients to practice with any multicolored flame, but he was able to perform auguries, and spent a lot of time doing research in that fashion. The only reason I succeeded in one shot was because of the heaven-cleaving good fortune pills. If I try again, it won't work as smoothly. Patting his bag of holding, he contemplated the fact that although he was running very low on resources, he at least had everything from 13 to 19 colored flame on hand. Some flames he only had one of, whereas he had multiple tongues of others. It was a collection that, if it were to be placed on public auction in the wildlands, would cause a massive commotion. In fact, even earthly necromancers would likely scramble to get their hands on it. After some thought, Bai Xiaochun decided that trying to auction his flames off wasn't a good idea. He could really only sell them directly. On another note, Bai Xiaochun had not forgotten his earlier promise to Zhou Yixing. In recent months, Bai Xiaochun had given him enough help and advice that he was now able to conjure his own 15-colored flame. That indicated that Zhou Yixing was now a celestial necromancer, which put him in a very excited and happy mood. In Zhou Yixing's clan, the only other celestial necromancer was one of the patriarchs. In fact, before meeting Bai Xiaochun, he wouldn't even have been able to dream of reaching that rank. But here he was, only a handful of years later, at that very level. Zhou Yixing knew that all of it was because of Bai Xiaochun's kindness. That filled his heart with gratitude, and further reinforced his conviction that he had made the right decision. As for Song Ke, he had spent the year or so of time resting and continuing to use soul medicine to advance his cultivation, something he was able to do because of how the Chen clan had forced his earlier breakthrough. Although he was still in the early nascent soul stage, his foundation was actually much stronger than before. Although he didn't have much hope of becoming a diva, with his foundation back to normal, there was still a possibility. Therefore, he felt extremely grateful for the chances he had been given, and felt more closely tied to the wildlands than ever. A few more months went by. Bai Xiaochun had been in the Underworld River restricted area for far more than a year now, and was starting to get bored. He had avoided opportunities to make a scene, and was starting to wonder if he should send a message to the Grand Heaven Master and ask to return to Arch-Emperor City. Even if he couldn't, he at least hoped he could get back to Giant Ghost City. However, even as Bai Xiaochun contemplated the subject, something happened in the wildlands, which nobody could ever have anticipated. It all happened because of a single person, a young man who appeared first in the northern part of the wildlands. He wore a white robe, and had flowing black hair and fair skin. He was always expressionless, and seemed profoundly arrogant. Bitter coldness surrounded him wherever he went, and his mere presence would cause gusts of wind and other heavenly phenomena. His cultivation base was very strange. Sometimes it seemed to be in the nascent soul stage, and other times, not. Wherever he went, slaughter ensued. In a short 3-day period, he exterminated 7 mid-sized tribes, and even 1 large tribe. On top of that, he wiped out a whole necromancer clan. He had already killed tens of thousands. It was a brutal type of slaughter. Everyone who died ended up as desiccated corpses, as though all of their life force had been completely drained away. Even their souls were completely gone. The northern wildlands were immediately thrown into chaos. However, most shocking of all was that on the 4th day, the culprit vanished without a trace, only to appear in the eastern wildlands, where more slaughter ensued. Days passed, and the death toll rose close to 100,000. The entire Arch-Emperor dynasty was enraged. This was clearly a bald-faced provocation. Most shocking of all was that the person carrying out these acts looked exactly like one of the most wanted people in the wildlands. Bai Xiaochun. It didn't take long before just about everyone came to the conclusion that this person really was Bai Xiaochun, who occupied first place on the Hell Emperor Steel, who had enhanced his own nascent soul to crush all other chosen beneath his feet. Bai Xiaochun has appeared again. He's been holed up for years. Finally, he shows his face again. Damn it, this is so brutal. He slaughtered 100,000 people. Bai Xiaochun has to die. Kill Bai Xiaochun. The news spread like storm winds, and it didn't take long before everyone in the wildlands had heard. It quickly became the main subject of discussion in both Archemperor City and the cities of the four heavenly kings. However, despite the slaughters which were being carried out, none of the four heavenly kings, nor the Archemperor dynasty, felt inclined to muster troops to do something about it. Considering the level of cultivation base of the most powerful experts, they felt it wouldn't be difficult at all to take care of the issue. Now that he's out in the open, it's time to just kill him. If he had remained in hiding, it would have been difficult to find him. But now he has the impertinence to do this? Does he really think the wildlands couldn't handle a measly nascent soul cultivator like him? Such words spread quickly among the nobility and aristocracy. As for Mistress Red Dust, she was particularly agitated by the news, and immediately requested of the Grand Heaven Master that she be allowed to take action to put an end to Bai Xiaochun. The Grand Heaven Master was busy with the proclamation of universal grace. However, he knew about the bad blood between Mistress Red Dust and Bai Xiaochun, so after only a short hesitation, he agreed to her request. Shortly thereafter, Mistress Red Dust took to action. She didn't go after Bai Xiaochun alone. After all, her fight with him in the past made her realize that he was very crafty and had many trump cards at his disposal. Therefore, she mustered nearly half of the giant ghost legion that was garrisoned at Archemperor City to go track Bai Xiaochun down and kill him. "This time you're definitely going to die by my hands, Bai Xiaochun," she said through gritted teeth as she left Archemperor City. Eventually, Zhou Yixing caught wind of the situation. He had been close to Bai Xiaochun for more than a year, but had many subordinates on the outside constantly feeding him information. Therefore, he was actually one of the first people to hear the news. At first, he was shocked, but managed to get himself under control. Although he wasn't sure about all the details, he knew that this was a very important matter, and immediately went to Bai Xiaochun to break the news. "Bai Xiaochun?" Bai Xiaochun said, his eyes widening with disbelief. Then he simply stared mutely at Zhou Yixing. Zhou Yixing was equally stunned, and was also well aware that the news spreading about Bai Xiaochun must be false. There was no way that the person in front of him could have just killed 100,000 people. "Yeah," he said, after appearing in public, "he killed more than 100,000 people. Zhou Zimo took nearly half of the giant ghost legion to go kill him." With that, he went on to explain everything he knew. The more Bai Xiaochun listened, the more surprised he became. It seemed completely unbelievable. "Who's impersonating me?" he thought. Something definitely seemed fishy. This was clearly an imposter who was intentionally causing problems for him. The fact that someone was killing tens of thousands of people in his name instantly made Bai Xiaochun furious. "You're trying to screw me up one side and down the other. No way. I have to go see what bastard is doing this." Anger burning, he made his decision about what to do. One of the reasons he wanted to go see who was impersonating him was because he was angry. The other was because he was worried. As far as he was concerned, there could only be two types of people who might impersonate him, either a friend or an enemy. If it was a friend, he might still be angry, but would still need to determine who it was, and why they were doing something so stupid. If that person was still alive, and deserved saving, then he would save them. If this person was an enemy, then he still wanted to know who exactly it was. Furthermore, he was confident that after all the spirit enhancements his mask had received, it was definitely powerful enough that a demigod wouldn't be able to see through it. As long as he didn't slip up accidentally, no one would be able to determine his true identity. At the moment, he was a very important person in the wildlands. He was the former inspections commissioner of Archemperor City, as well as an earthly necromancer. Either one of those positions was one that would put him in a position to trample the wildlands beneath his feet. "I can't just go off by myself. The best thing would be to go with Mistress Red Dust and the Giant Ghost Legion. Going with them will make my cover impossible to break." Having made his decision, he calmed himself down, and then left with Song Ke and Zhou Yixing, borrowing the Underworld River Restricted Area Brigade's heavenly airship. He didn't pause for even a moment along the way. The Underworld River Restricted Area was located in the central wildlands, not very far from the eastern regions. In the very moments in which Mistress Red Dust was making her final preparations for departure, he transmitted a polite message to her indicating that he wished to escort her along her way. At first, she was inclined to ignore him. However, she was still angry about what had gone on between her and Bai Hao in the inspections manner, and decided that this would be the perfect opportunity to teach him a lesson or two. Smiling coldly, she agreed to meet up. And thus, only a few days later, Bai Xiaochun arrived at the appointed meeting location with Mistress Red Dust. It was one of the many ordinary teleportation portals scattered throughout the wildlands, a place guarded year-round by powerful soul cultivators. As soon as Bai Xiaochun arrived, everyone recognized him and offered respectful greetings. Bai Xiaochun was completely wrapped up in thoughts about who was impersonating him and was in no mood for chatting. He simply waited outside of the teleportation portal for some time until it began to shine with bright, flickering light. Moments later, numerous figures began to pour out of it, who were none other than the soldiers of the giant ghost legion. They all nodded in greeting upon seeing him, after which they fanned out to seal down the area. After everything was secured, the teleportation portal flickered again, and more forces poured out to reinforce the perimeter. Soon, there were more than 10,000 people present. Last to emerge were Mistress Red Dust and her private guard. As soon as Bai Xiaochun laid eyes on Mistress Red Dust, he thought back to what had occurred back in the inspections manor, and cleared his throat. Of course, he was a different person than he was back then. He was now an earthly necromancer, and therefore, he looked over at Mistress Red Dust and gave her a friendly smile and nod. She looked at him coldly and let out a snort. She knew that if she wanted to teach him a lesson, she needed to be patient. Furthermore, her main priority was to find Bai Xiaochun. Therefore, she sent some divine scents out into the area to inspect it, and after confirming everything was in order, flew up into the air. The more than 10,000 members of the giant ghost legion followed her. Under normal circumstances, the fact that she was ignoring him would have prompted Bai Xiaochun to cast a glare back at her. But right now, he was in a precarious political situation. Furthermore, he was very anxious about the matter of the Bai Xiaochun imposter. Therefore, he simply endured the situation and followed the soldiers. Nobody spoke as they sped along behind Mistress Red Dust. Anger burned in her beautiful eyes as she proceeded along, a jade slip in hand which constantly gave her updates and news. After a few hours passed, she suddenly pointed off into the distance. All clues point to the fact that Bai Xiaochun is still in the East Wildlands. He was last seen in a location roughly 5,000 kilometers from Mount Amity. Clearly, his next target is none other than that very mountain. With that, she picked up speed, as did the grim soldiers she led. They became thousands of beams of bright light which streaked through the air at top speed. This Zhou Zimo is no good at all at leading soldiers. Bai Xiaochun thought. Unless the imposter Bai Xiaochun is a complete idiot, there's no way he would just stick around waiting for people to come after him. He was just about to offer his opinion on the matter when Mistress Red Dust looked at him with cold eyes. The villain Bai Xiaochun has already been in this area for about half a month, she said. Every time he shows up, he sticks around in the same area for a certain period of time before leaving. So whatever it was that you were about to say, just stow it. Bai Xiaochun felt a bit awkward. It was obvious that Mistress Red Dust was still brooding over the events in the inspections manor. However, he couldn't help but be shocked by what she had just told him, and, feeling that he had no other choice, he hurried over to speak with her more privately. Something's off here, he said. Why would he stay in one place? What if he's waiting for us? Zimo, this sounds like a trap. The more he thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Based on what he had been told before, he assumed that the imposter Bai Xiaochun was randomly going around committing crimes. Therefore, this new information seemed very disconcerting. Mistress Red Dust snorted coldly. Of course it's a trap. That's why I didn't come alone. I brought an army with me. Now that Bai Xiaochun was getting a better idea of the details of the situation, he was feeling more and more nervous. Taking a deep breath, he decided to offer some more advice. Hold on. No, something is really off. Zimo, I recommend you hold back. Send in the army to scout around first. Or maybe ask His Highness the King to come. Shut up, Mistress Red Dust said with an impatient wave of her hand. Nobody asked you to come along. You came on your own. Besides, who knows Bai Xiaochun better, me or you? Inwardly, Bai Xiaochun rolled his eyes about 100,000 times. He really wished he could point out to this Zhou Zimo that of course she didn't understand Bai Xiaochun better than Bai Xiaochun himself. However, there was no way he could say such a thing, and he merely had to let the fires of frustration burn in his heart as Mistress Red Dust flew off into the distance. Of course, it wasn't as if Mistress Red Dust hadn't made any advance preparations. In fact, she felt herself to be completely and utterly prepared. Furthermore, she hated Bai Xiaochun deep in her bones, and wanted nothing more than to kill him. At the moment, she was completely confident that, even if he did have some unknown superhuman abilities, considering she herself was a diva, she should definitely be able to crush him. Maybe if he were somewhere else I could ignore it. But this is the East Wildlands. My father the king is right around the corner in Giant Ghost City. If anything unexpected happens, father will come immediately to help me. Laughing coldly inside, she felt more confident than ever about what was going to happen. Ignoring Bai Xiaochun's words of warning, she continued on toward Mount Amity. Bai Xiaochun was already starting to regret how things were turning out. The intelligence reports he had read earlier had been very vague, leaving him mostly in the dark. But now that he knew more, he was in a very tough position. Finally, he stamped his foot in frustration and followed after Mistress Red Dust, his vigilance growing by the moment. If anything weird happens, I'm out of here, he thought nervously. As he proceeded along, he surveyed the area constantly, both with eyesight and divine sense. To him, everything in the area seemed cold and sinister, which caused a sensation of imminent crisis to rise up in his heart. It's so cold. It's a frigid chi that seems familiar. Even as he pondered the matter, Mount Amity appeared up ahead. Mount Amity featured 5 mountain peaks that looked almost like a hand. It rose up out of the dense jungle into the evening sky, creating a stark silhouette that immediately filled one with a sense of foreboding. The jungle was extremely quiet, even after the giant ghost legion arrived. As for Bai Xiaochun, he looked around, scalp tingling at the realization that all of the trees in the jungle were withered up and dead. It was almost as if all of their life force had been completely sucked away. Mistress Red Dust and the giant ghost legion also noticed this fact, and their expressions turned even more serious than before. However, they didn't slow down. Instead, they shot out over the jungle toward Mount Amity. Before they could reach the mountain, however, sinister laughter suddenly erupted from the third of Mount Amity's looming peaks. Hee hee hee, you people certainly took your time. So few of you. I'm actually still a bit hungry. It was impossible to tell whether the voice belonged to a man or a woman. It was piercing, and almost sounded like a man, woman, and child all talking at the same time. Even as the voice erupted out into the open, a figure appeared on the third mountain peak. It was a young man in a long white robe, with flowing black hair. Shockingly, he had 2 pupils in each eye, and his mouth was twisted in a bizarre smile. Then, he stuck his tongue out and licked his lips. As for his facial features, he looked exactly like Bai Xiaochun. However, as soon as Bai Xiaochun saw this person, his mind was battered by tsunamis of shock. He even shivered, and his pupils constricted as he breathed. Gongsun Wan'er. This person was none other than Gongsun Wan'er. She looked different, as she was impersonating Bai Xiaochun. But as soon as he laid eyes on her, he recognized her. It was mostly because of her smile, the way she licked her lips, and the way she talked about being hungry. The enormity of it all struck him like a lightning bolt. He suddenly thought back to the labyrinth, and all of the indescribably terrifying things he had seen there. A ghost, he thought, shivering uncontrollably. In fact, he almost screamed. Back in the labyrinth, Gongsun Wan'er had revealed everything to him, confirming that she was the very same young girl from the Fallen Sword Abyss, the one with the little teddy bear. Where's Lei Shan? He thought. In almost that exact moment, a figure appeared behind Gongsun Wan'er, a tall, burly man. However, he was bright red, because of the fact that he had no skin on his body. His face was expressionless, as if he couldn't even feel pain. As he stood there next to Gongsun Wan'er, he emanated the most terrifying of auras. He was none other than Lei Shan, whom the girl had captured and skinned alive in the Fallen Sword Abyss. Bai Xiaochun's heart was beginning to pound even harder. He knew how terrifying Gongsun Wan'er was, and was sure that Mistress Red Dust was not a match for her. Without any hesitation, he pulled out a jade slip to send a message, only to find that the jade slip wouldn't work. His breath stuck in his throat, and he considered whether or not to just flee. From what he could tell, Gongsun Wan'er hadn't recognized him, and therefore, getting away and sending word to the giant ghost king seemed like the best plan at this point. However, before he could even begin to flee, Mistress Red Dust narrowed her eyes and made a grasping motion to summon a red lotus. So, you finally show your face, Bai Xiaochun. Prepare to die. Although Mistress Red Dust could tell that there was something different about this Bai Xiaochun than before, she didn't have time to think about the matter. She quickly performed an incantation gesture, causing diva fluctuations to roll out. Then she waved her finger, and the air rippled as the enormous illusory image of a finger appeared and shot toward Mount Amity. In the instant that the finger appeared, Lei Shan looked up, and a brutal gleam could be seen in his eyes. Throwing his head back, he howled, a heaven-rending, earth-crushing sound which rolled out in a wave-like attack. Then he stamped his foot down, causing the third peak of Mount Amity to collapse as he shot upward into the air. Intense rumbling sounds echoed out as the sky went dim. Amidst the rushing wind, Mistress Red Dust's pupils constricted, and she performed another incantation gesture. Deploy formation, she shouted. Instantly, the more than 10,000 soldiers of the giant ghost legion fanned out around Mount Amity, creating a massive spell formation. In order to avoid attracting attention, Bai Xiaochun tried to stick close to one of the soul cultivator soldiers. However, it was in that moment, when the third peak was still crumbling to the ground, that Gongsun Wan'er vanished. When she reappeared, she wasn't near Mistress Red Dust but rather, next to a core formation soldier who was powering the spell formation. She moved with such incredible speed that the core formation soul cultivator couldn't even react. Gongsun Wan'er breathed in, and the soul cultivator shivered. In the briefest of moments, his body withered up, and soul light emerged from his eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. At that point, he was nothing more than a desiccated corpse. His life force, his soul, and everything else about him had been absorbed by Gongsun Wan'er. At that point, eerie laughter rang out over the battlefield, causing all hearts to shudder. Bai Xiaochun already felt like he was going crazy from fear, and was wailing inwardly. As for Mistress Red Dust, her face fell as she performed another incantation gesture, unleashing diva power in a deadly attack on Gongsun Wan'er. However, before she could move very far, the burly Lei Shan blurred into motion, striking at her with a meaty fist. Booms rang out as Lei Shan and Mistress Red Dust began fighting. As for Lei Shan, he seemed almost indestructible. Although Mistress Red Dust's magical techniques slammed into him, his expression didn't change at all, and he continued to attack without let-up. "Damn it," Mistress Red Dust said, her expression flickering. Gongsun Wan'er's laughter continued to float out across the battlefield as she flitted back and forth between the soul cultivators, transforming each and every one into a withered corpse. As she did, her aura grew stronger and stronger. At this point, Gongsun Wan'er's voice began to float out. "Your people have just the chi and blood I was looking for, and cultivation base too. The tribal savages have incomplete spiritual and physical souls. Even 100 of them don't match up to a single one of you." The giant Ghost Legion soldiers' expressions flickered with shock as they realized that their spell formation was completely useless. Furthermore, when their divine abilities landed on Gongsun Wan'er, they didn't affect her or slow her down at all. No one could fight back against her. The soldiers could only watch helplessly as their comrades were shriveled up into corpses and absorbed. It was a terrifying sight. Within a very short period of time, hundreds of people had been transformed into dried-up corpses. Even more horrifying was that after absorbing so many soul cultivators, Gongsun Wan'er was transforming. Chuckling bizarrely, she no longer had to teleport back and forth, but instead, sent her hair flying out in all directions, simultaneously attacking nearly 1,000 people at once. In the blink of an eye, numerous strands of hair had stabbed into the foreheads of the soul cultivators, and began to suck them dry. Screams rang out, but were quickly silenced as everyone became a withered corpse. Gongsun Wan'er's face glowed more healthily than ever, and her eyes shone with a bizarre light. Still a bit hungry, the remaining giant Ghost Legion soldiers were visibly shocked, and began to fall back, not willing at all to face this creature in battle. Bai Xiaochun was among them, his heart pounding with vigilance. However, as of this moment, Gongsun Wan'er still didn't seem to have noticed him. Gongsun Wan'er retracted her hair from the nearly 1,000 corpses, and then took a breath. Meanwhile, Mistress Red Dust, her eyes shining with red light, performed a double-handed incantation gesture, summoning an enormous figure behind her, a Dharma idol that bore her visage. "Get the hell out of here," she shouted. The Dharma idol radiated a murderous air as it performed an incantation gesture, causing it to shine with boundless light and then transform into an enormous red spear which was launched toward Lei Shan. Not even Lei Shan could defend against that spear, which stabbed directly into his chest, then carried him flying toward Mount Amity. A moment later, he and the spear slammed into the mountain, whereupon a bright red light exploded out, along with heaven-shaking, earth-shattering rumbling sounds. All 4 of the remaining peaks of the mountain shattered, sending out a shockwave that turned the surrounding jungle into nothing more than ash. A moment later, the dust cleared, revealing an enormous crater, at the bottom of which lay Lei Shan, completely motionless, a head-sized hole in his chest. Mistress Red Dust was left ashen-faced and gasping for breath after unleashing this particular divine ability. However, her phoenix-like eyes shone with murder as she unhesitatingly shot toward Gongsun Wan'er. The surrounding soldiers were enlivened at the sight, but not Bai Xiaochun. He knew that Lei Shan was nothing more than a puppet, and that if it took a divine ability the likes of which Mistress Red Dust had just unleashed to kill him, then that only went to show how difficult it would be to take out Gongsun Wan'er. Well, let's see what happens, he thought nervously. If Mistress Red Dust can seize the advantage, maybe I'll jump in and help her. If not, then I'll try to get her to escape. Bai Xiaochun had long since begun to think about making his own escape. However, he had the feeling that unless he did it with the entire group, it would attract unwanted attention from Gongsun Wan'er. It was very worrisome that not only had she been following him for such a long time, but she had also begun impersonating him. If Bai Xiaochun didn't grasp the implications of that, then he didn't deserve to have practiced cultivation for so long. She's fishing for me. The mere thought caused his scalp to tingle violently and his heart to pound with regret. Bai Xiaochun was trembling in fear. It was obvious that Lei Shan was vastly more powerful than he had been in the past, although it had clearly come at incredible cost. However, whether or not he had been killed in the interchange just now, one thing was clear: he had already died in battle in the past. Can dead people die again? He thought, terrified as he looked over at Lei Shan's corpse. However, Lei Shan wasn't moving at all, whereas Mistress Red Dust and Gongsun Wanner were fighting more fiercely than ever. By this point, Mistress Red Dust realized that she was up against a formidable opponent, and was performing constant double-handed incantation gestures to send out beams of red light that seemed capable of slashing the air into bits. The red lotus that was her magical item swirled around her, occasionally sending out bursts of flower petals. As a result, she was constantly surrounded by diva power that could exterminate anything it touched. And yet, that was only secondary. Most important was her own diva cultivation base, which sent out pressure that could crush onto nascent soul cultivators like a mountain. Whether physically or mentally, that pressure would be difficult to bear. Most opponents who faced it would likely be destroyed in body and soul without even being able to fight back. However, Gongsun Wanner was no ordinary opponent. The magical technique she currently employed was bizarre. She launched rings of black light out into the air, each and every one of which was filled with destructive power that sucked away at Mistress Red Dust's life force. One of the most shocking things was Gongsun Wanner's speed. She moved so indescribably quickly that she was little more than a blur that left a string of afterimages behind. As the battle progressed, more and more black rings began to build up around Mistress Red Dust. Rumbling sounds echoed out without cease. Clearly, Gongsun Wanner's cultivation base was not at the level of a diva's, and yet, she didn't seem to feel any pressure at all when fighting Mistress Red Dust. Even more strange was that Bai Xiaochun could just barely make out a Dharma idol behind the afterimages of Gongsun Wanner. The Dharma idol depicted a woman in a black robe, spectacularly beautiful, with a look of incredibly arrogant contempt in her eyes. The fight was actually getting closer to Bai Xiaochun, and the magical techniques they were using made the area very dangerous. Shockwaves blasted out constantly, making it impossible for him or any of the other soldiers to even get close. Bai Xiaochun actually had it better off than many of the other soldiers. Some of them were being affected by some sort of gravitational force that sucked away at their life force, turning their hair white. If people nearby were having trouble, then there was little need to mention how badly things were going for Mistress Red Dust. She had a very unsightly expression on her face, and yet, had no time to even speak. Every bit of her concentration was focused on the fighting. This Bai Xiaochun that she was fighting was far more difficult to deal with than she had anticipated. He almost didn't seem like the same person she had fought in the past. In fact, although he looked physically like Bai Xiaochun, when it came to his aura, he seemed like a different person. He was definitely very different from anything she remembered. Mistress Red Dust's divine abilities didn't seem capable of harming him at all. Furthermore, the black rings of light being sent against her actually affected her mentally. He's definitely not in the nascent soul stage, she thought, shocked. The entire time, a strange smile could be seen on Gongsun Wanner's face, and her eyes flickered with a strange light. She continuously licked her lips, as though she were thinking about how delicious Mistress Red Dust was, and how wonderful it would be to consume her. Bai Xiaochun was shocked by what he was seeing, and began to back up as quickly as possible. As he watched the women fight, he noticed that the Dharma idol from before was now nowhere to be seen. He even wondered if he had actually been seeing things. By now, he had come to the realization that Mistress Red Dust was not going to be able to keep the fight going for very long. Heart-pounding, he began to consider how to convince her to flee. However, it was at that point that the situation suddenly changed. Mistress Red Dust's eyes erupted with a murderous light, and she suddenly lurched backward. In response, Gongsun Wanner smiled, and was about to charge after her, when her expression suddenly flickered, and she backed up. As she did, Mistress Red Dust's chest heaved, and her eyes shone with a light of madness. Suddenly, diva fluctuations rolled out of her with explosive force and speed, merging with creation around her, making her seem like she was the overlord of all heaven and earth. "You will be killed beyond the shadow of a doubt, Bai Xiaochun," she shouted, seemingly filled with a sudden burst of determination. With that, she performed an incantation gesture, causing her face to turn pale as a drop of blood flew out from her index finger. The blood glittered as brightly as a precious treasure, and as it appeared, all light in the area went dim. It was clearly no ordinary blood. In fact, this was a magical technique of Mistress Red Dust's, something that combined the power of her cultivation base and her life essence to create a drop of magical blood. It wasn't soul blood. However, this magical blood contained elements of Mistress Red Dust's enlightenment regarding the great Tao's of heaven and earth. As soon as it appeared in the open, it transformed into a blood-red spear. At first glance, it was far more shocking that the spear she had just used to cut down Lei Shan. In fact, it even caused Gongsun Wanner's expression to flicker, which caused a bit of hope to rise in Bai Xiaochun's heart. Without any hesitation, Mistress Red Dust hefted the spear and then launched it at Gongsun Wanner. Sonic booms echoed out as the spear pierced through the air, appearing almost instantly right in front of Gongsun Wanner. And yet, Gongsun Wanner then erupted into a blur of speed, dodging out to the side so that the spear stabbed halfway into the ground behind her. Bai Xiaochun gasped. The mere sight of the spear filled him with a sensation of danger, and he almost couldn't believe it had failed to hit its mark. Even as Gongsun Wanner backed up from the spear, Mistress Red Dust hovered in midair, her eyes shining with red light as another drop of blood appeared at the tip of her middle finger. It was a second drop of magical blood. It immediately turned into a second spear, which shot forth in attack. Then blood emerged from her ring finger, pinky finger, and thumb. In the end, 4 more spears were flung out, and although Gongsun Wanner managed to evade all of them, they ended up stabbing into the ground in a rough semicircle. They were like a barricade that caused Gongsun Wanner's expression to flicker. Just when she seemed inclined to flee, a 6th spear appeared, and then a 7th. More spears of magical blood flew out, stabbing into the ground around Gongsun Wanner until they formed a complete circle. By the time this was accomplished, Mistress Red Dust was breathing heavily, and her face was virtually devoid of any color. Using magical blood to power such techniques was very draining, and wasn't something she could use in a protracted fight. However, the results were shocking. Gongsun Wanner was clearly in trouble, and wanted to flee, but as soon as she got near any of the spears, black mist would begin to rise up from her, almost as if she were beginning to melt, and she would be forced to back up. The surrounding giant Ghost Legion soldiers were enlivened, and began to edge forward to offer assistance, Bai Xiaochun among them. However, that was when the trapped Gongsun Wanner glared over at Mistress Red Dust and let out a shrill scream that pierced into the minds of everyone present, filling them with pain. As for the 10 spears, they suddenly began to crack and splinter. Mistress Red Dust's expression flickered, and yet, she didn't seem alarmed. Phoenix-like eyes shining with murderous intent, she performed a double-handed incantation gesture and then waved her fingers toward the spears. "Shatter and destroy," she said. Blood-red light erupted from the 10 spears as they ripped out of the ground and shot toward Gongsun Wanner. Before she could do anything, they stabbed through her, and then circled back around for another attack. From Bai Xiaochun's perspective, it was like countless beams of red light forming a blood-colored net around and through Gongsun Wanner. Obviously, she would soon be killed in body and soul. At the same time, Gongsun Wanner's screams echoed across the battlefield. It was a frightening sight to Bai Xiaochun, and suddenly he was struck by how powerful Mistress Red Dust was. Clearly, she was about to win this fight, and it caused both her and everyone else present to sigh with relief. And yet, for some reason, Bai Xiaochun felt like it was all a bit too ruthless. After all, Gongsun Wanner never did anything to hurt me. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.